In 2012, Canada and the province of Newfoundland and Labrador approved the Lower Churchill Hydroelectric Development Project, despite serious concerns about local environmental, social, economic, and health impacts on the host region of Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador. FemNorthNet's research gave voice to local women. Their message? Clean energy should be fair energy. We respectfully acknowledge our work on Indigenous territories and the legacy of colonization.
The Lower Churchill Development Project is a hydroelectric project that's been proposed jointly by Nalcor Energy in Newfoundland and Labrador and Emera, which is based in Nova Scotia and owns Nova Scotia Power. The first phase of the Lower Churchill development is Muskrat Falls, which would flood 41 kilometers squared of land and produce 824 megawatts of electricity. 20% of those megawatts, so about 180 megawatts, would go to Nova Scotia. And that's in exchange for Nova Scotia Power agreeing to build the Maritime Link. 40% of that electricity would immediately flow through to the island of Newfoundland. And Newfoundland would use that to shut down Holyrood, a generation facility on the island of Newfoundland that uses bunker C oil to produce electricity currently, which is one of the most polluting fuels that can be used to produce electricity. And 40% of the 824 megawatts being produced at Muskrat Falls does not currently have a contracted buyer. And so it would be up for market use for Nalcor to sell on the open market. Nova Scotia would have first dibs on buying some of that 40% of the remaining electricity. The second phase of the Lower Churchill development, not currently underway and no contracts are in place for that development at this point in time, is Gull Island. Gull Island would produce 2,250 megawatts of electricity, and it would flood 85 square kilometers of land. Nova Scotia is entitled to 20% of the electricity flowing from Muskrat Falls because they have agreed to build the Maritime Link. Maritime Link would be two cables connecting the island of Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. And those two cables would each have a capacity of 250 megawatts, which together is a 500 megawatt capacity. The Maritime Link will join Nova Scotia and the island of Newfoundland for the first time. Another transmission link called the Labrador Island Link is associated with the Lower Churchill development. That link has a capacity of 900 megawatts and it will connect Labrador and Newfoundland. So the island of Newfoundland, which is currently completely disconnected from the North American grid, will be connected to the North American grid for the first time. And with the Maritime Link, there will be a loop established between the Atlantic provinces and surrounding regions to transmit energy. Labrador Island Link and Maritime Link are both subsea cables, so they will run underneath bodies of water. Getting the electricity from Muskrat Falls through to those subsea cables will mean building a network of transmission lines above ground. Federal Environmental Assessment Panel was called for the Lower Churchill development. That panel was taking a look at both phases of Lower Churchill, both Muskrat Falls and Gull Island. The panel found that there are irreversible adverse social and ecological impacts associated with this development, and it made a series of recommendations to project proponents to attempt to mitigate those impacts. Those proposals were not followed through with. The environmental assessment was passed according to federal mandate, which means that the environmental assessment for the entire Lower Churchill development has been approved. Currently, Muskrat Falls, the first phase of the Lower Churchill development, is underway. The Gull Island development is not yet initiated. We are unsure of when plans are being laid for that development to take place, and there are no contracts in place as yet. Part of the challenge is we have a project that poses significant benefits for the region. So it will help the Atlantic Canadian region move away from fossil fuel dependence. And in that regard, it will help the region do its part to mitigate global climate change. And it will help us to radically transform our electricity and energy infrastructure so that we can plan for a future where we have significantly reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. So we have this kind of regional, national, even global level benefit, but the impact is extremely local. The impact is really leveled at the people that live in Labrador that have loved and camped around and visited Muskrat Falls for decades, for centuries really. The impact is to the history of this incredibly rich part of Labrador and to the spiritual power and significance that those communities that have lived around this watershed experience. There are very real impacts in terms of flooding large areas of land and what that might mean for methane levels in the soil and mercury levels as well through the food chain. It has impacts on animals that use this part of the Churchill Falls. And of course, for animals that exist in the part of the land that will be inundated. So we have, on the one hand, extremely local impacts, and on the other, fairly dispersed benefits, which means that there is a challenge to make sure that those benefits are translated at the local level and that there is very genuine dialogue happening at the local level to ensure that people are heard and that the relationship that communities, both human and non-human communities, have to this part of Labrador are honored. As I have said, we're in a situation where we are faced with enormous challenges, and the threat of climate change is very difficult to deal with because our entire world is predicated on an addiction to fossil fuels, and shifting away from that is hugely difficult. We see the impacts of climate change happening all around us, and the communities in Labrador that will be impacted by this project are also experiencing already the impacts of climate change. So a project is being proposed to help the region address climate change that Labradorian communities may not see the ways in which climate change is being addressed within their own homes by this project that they are being impacted by. It's a very challenging situation, and it is a part of a context that we find ourselves in where we have to make some really tough choices. But it's important that as we make those tough choices, we honor the integrity of communities and ensure that everyone is involved and that nobody's left out.